you watched episode 1 where I cleaned my shed, you saw a little piece of the bottom of this table and I mentioned I would be epoxying it. I'll take you through the steps I followed, but full disclosure, I've never epoxied anything before and I'm learning as I go. The first step was to vacuum the whole thing to make sure there was nothing on the table that would get stuck in the epoxy. I pulled off one of the bottle caps with the vacuum cleaner and I'm going to glue it back on using super glue. I actually used little dabs of a construction adhesive called liquid nails to glue all the caps on, just enough so they didn't float up or move when I poured the epoxy. Stick around until the end and I'll show you how I flattened all the bottle caps. Some of the caps are upside down, showing the words or pictures that are on the inside of the cap, and I'm taping those off with painter's tape so the first pour of epoxy doesn't fill those up. I'm going to pour black epoxy first to hide the tabletop and glue and make the colors of the caps really pop. Here's the whole table with all of the upside down caps taped off. The next step was to make sure it was level all the way around. I also put a tarp underneath to catch any epoxy that leaked through or flowed off the edges. I googled round epoxy calculator to get an idea of how much epoxy I was going to need, and it asked for the diameter of the circle and the preferred depth of the epoxy, so I'm getting those measurements here. Came out to about a gallon of epoxy for a 50-inch circle at a 1/4 inch deep. Here's the supplies that I used, as well as a respirator mask. Gloves are very important. I decided to use some packing tape around the edge to slow any runoff. From all that I've seen and read about epoxy, mixing it properly and adequately is very important to ensure it hardens and doesn't remain sticky. Epoxy is to be mixed equal parts resin and hardener. The epoxy I purchased said to stir it for 3 to 6 minutes. I stirred for 3, being sure to scrape the edges of the containers to get it thoroughly mixed. I then poured a bit of black acrylic paint into the mix and stirred for another 3 minutes. Having never done this before, I thought the epoxy would spread between the caps when I poured it. It did not. I began pouring it everywhere while trying to keep it off the top of the caps as best I could. I used my glove to wipe off the black epoxy on the caps that really needed it. I tried the paintbrush, but that just smeared it around, so I went back to the glove. While mixing up the next batch of epoxy, I had the brilliant idea to use a big syringe to pipe the epoxy between the caps. This worked well, although I did still get a few drops on some of the caps. I used this method to epoxy the entire tabletop. The next morning, the black epoxy had hardened, but it had leaked through some of the cracks in the table and wasn't solid black in some spots. I mixed up another batch of epoxy and filled all of the light spots with black, hoping the previous day's pour had sealed off the cracks. Once that was done, I decided to remove the painter's tape covering the upside down caps so that the tape didn't end up getting stuck in the hardened epoxy. The next morning, the black epoxy was a success and all the space between the caps were solid black and hardened. You can see the black drips on some of the caps, and now that it's hardened, I can scrape these off with a razor blade. Be careful and don't cut toward yourself if you try this. I pulled the tape off so that I could paint the edge with the same paint I used to tint the epoxy black. Also hope the pores of clear epoxy will run down the sides and seal the black paint. Although the tape had adhered to the epoxy, it was still reasonably easy to pull off. I again vacuumed the entire table to remove any loose epoxy chips I had scraped off. I then mixed a batch of clear epoxy, again remembering to mix it thoroughly. I want the clear epoxy to cover the bottle caps entirely, allowing for a smooth top. I poured the entire batch in the middle of the table, again hoping it would spread on its own. Mixing a second batch, I also poured this in the middle. If you look closely here, you can see the epoxy spreading while I mix up another batch. It wasn't spreading fast enough, so for the third batch I decided to pour around the edges of where it had spread to. Again, looking closely, you can see the spread here. For the fourth batch, I poured it as close to the edge of the table as I was comfortable with, and found that tilting the table allowed me to guide the epoxy to areas I thought needed it. Gold foil from some of the caps began drifting when I tilted the table, and I'd have to put that back in place. For the fifth pour, I was careful to fill any of the upside down caps that needed it, and focused on pouring as close to the edge of the table as possible. I used a paintbrush to wipe down the sides of the table where the epoxy would begin to drip. The next morning the epoxy had hardened and had a beautiful glossy shine, but some of the caps near the edge weren't completely covered with epoxy. I had enough for one more pour, so I taped off the edges again to stop the runoff. I wiped down the whole table with rubbing alcohol to remove any grease or dirt or dust. I poured this last batch close to the edge since that was the area I needed more depth. Since it wasn't enough to cover the entire table, I used the side of a stir stick to spread the freshly poured epoxy and try to get good coverage, hoping for an even, glossy finish in the end. Although I hadn't had any problems with bubbles up to this point, I used a torch to pop any bubbles I saw, since this will be the final pour. At this point I realized the table was stuck to the boards I had underneath it. I did a little more tilting to get the epoxy where I wanted it to fill in some low spots. I was having trouble with the tape leaning in towards the table, so I used a razor to cut slots in the tape so I could bend it back. I let this sit for a couple of hours and came back to pull off the tape before it hardened entirely. I want the top corner to round over slightly rather than be a sharp edge that I have to sand off. At this point the epoxy is thick and sticky, but still a consistency that will give me that rounded edge. I used a stir stick to smooth the drips where I could around the edge, and then I let it sit overnight. The next morning it had cured, and it was time to drill the hole in the middle for my umbrella. I measured to find center and put a mark. I used a hole saw to cut through the table. Although the table was epoxied to the boards under it, they broke loose with a quick smack, and I was real happy about that. As you can see, it came out very well for my having never done this, and I was very happy with the final product. Here you can see how I made the tabletop out of cedar fence boards, 2 layers thick, glued and screwed together. I want to remove these sharp, hardened epoxy drips. I'll use a grinder with a sanding pad on it for that. I am so happy with the way this thing turned out. There are some things I'd do differently if I had to do it over again, but learning is always a part of the process. It's a great conversation piece and everyone enjoys playing Bottle Cap I Spy while sitting around it. Here's the bonus of how to flatten bottle caps. You're going to need your bottle caps, a hammer, and a wood dowel. I believe this is a 5/8 inch dowel, and a hard flat surface. You could use a piece of wood, but I'm using the top of my table saw. Turn the bottle cap upside down and place a wood dowel in the center. And smack it a few times with the hammer. You don't have to hit it too hard, but if it isn't flat enough, you can always smack it again. The table will look much better if all the caps are flat on top. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that it inspires you to make something. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.